The shelter was alive with noise, barking, whining, metal bowls clinking against concrete floors. Yet, in the farthest, darkest corner of Kennel 12, there was silence. A German shepherd sat there, pressed so tightly against the wall, it looked as if he was trying to disappear into it. His fur was matted, his ribs faintly visible beneath a once-proud frame. And his eyes didn't meet anyone's. They stared into the empty space between the wall and the floor, as if the world around him no longer mattered. Nobody knew exactly how long he had been living like this. The shelter intake form only said, "Stray, found near old rail yard." There was no collar, no tags, no microchip. The animal control officer who brought him in remembered how he had to crouch for over an hour, speaking softly, before the dog would even move. And when he finally did, it wasn't towards the man, it was away from him. Shelter staff gave him a name, Shadow. It seemed fitting. He was quiet, he was distant, and he clung to the darkest parts of his small concrete world. Other dogs barked and wagged their tails when people passed by, desperate for attention. Shadow stayed still, always still. Some volunteers whispered that he was a lost cause. Others thought he might be aggressive, but he had never once bared his teeth, or growled. Instead, he simply avoided everyone. As if human contact was more terrifying than hunger. In those first days, they tried everything. They placed fresh blankets in his kennel. He ignored them. They offered treats. He wouldn't even sniff them. They brought in the gentlest, most experienced volunteers. He only turned his head to face the wall. Every night, the shelter quieted down. Lights dimmed, the barking faded, and the building became still. That's when Shadow would move. Security cameras showed him pacing slowly in circles, glancing at the locked kennel gate as though it were a prison door. Sometimes, he would sit facing it, his ears twitching at the faintest sound outside. It was as if he was waiting for someone, but who? One rainy afternoon, a young volunteer named Marissa decided to try something different. She didn't stand at his kennel and speak to him like the others. She didn't offer food or toys. She simply pulled up a plastic chair, sat down about 5 feet away from the gate, and began reading aloud from a book she had brought. She didn't even look at him. For the first 20 minutes, Shadow didn't move, but the camera caught it later, the slightest turn of his head in her direction. His ears twitched, catching the rhythm of her voice. Still, he didn't approach. Marissa came back the next day, and the next, always reading, always keeping her voice calm and steady. Staff noticed the change, but it was small, almost invisible. He no longer kept his eyes glued to the corner. Sometimes, he glanced towards the sound of her voice. Sometimes, he even sniffed the air. But if anyone stepped closer, he shut down again, tucking his head low and shivering. Shadow's fear wasn't just shyness, it was deep bone-level distrust, the kind that doesn't come from one bad day, but from years of something worse. No one knew what he'd been through before the rail yard. No one could ask him, and no one could undo it. They could only try, one moment at a time, to convince him that not all humans wanted to hurt him. Still, the days turned into weeks, and Shadow remained in his corner. Other dogs came and went, adopted into new homes, their kennels cleaned and prepared for the next arrival. Shadow's kennel never emptied. His name stayed on the whiteboard, circled in red marker under the word special care. The shelter had rules. Dogs that couldn't be socialized after a certain number of weeks often faced alternative placement, a phrase staff hated to say out loud. It meant the space could be needed for other dogs who had a better chance of finding homes. Nobody wanted to talk about it, but the quiet tension grew heavier each day. Shadow refused to come out. And then, something happened. It was a Wednesday morning. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and bright. A man walked into the shelter lobby, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel. His clothes were plain, his boots dusty from travel. When the receptionist asked if he was looking for a dog, he simply said, "I'm here for the one they call Shadow." The staff exchanged glances. They didn't recognize him, and he hadn't called ahead. But something in his voice carried weight. Not demand, not urgency, just certainty. The kennel area was loud, as usual. Dogs jumped and barked as the man walked by, but he didn't look at them. His eyes moved only once. When he reached the last row, the corner where Shadow lived, he stopped. He didn't crouch. He didn't speak. He just stood there, still as stone. Shadow looked up. It wasn't much, just a flicker of movement, but it was the first time in weeks the dog had lifted his head to meet a stranger's gaze. His ears twitched once. His tail didn't wag, but it also didn't tuck. The man didn't move closer. He didn't raise his hand. Instead, he lowered himself to the cold concrete floor, sitting cross-legged right there in the middle of the aisle. He set the leather satchel down beside him, unzipped it, and pulled out something small, a folded piece of cloth. From the corner, Shadow's nose twitched. He shifted, almost imperceptibly, his eyes fixed on the cloth in the man's hands. The shelter staff held their breath. They had no idea what was about to happen, but they all felt it. The folded cloth in the man's hands was nothing remarkable to anyone else, just an old, faded bandana. But to Shadow, it was something entirely different. The moment the fabric caught the air, his nose twitched again. His eyes sharpened, following the motion as the man set the bandana gently on the floor between them. The staff watched from a distance, whispering quietly to each other. "What's he doing? Do you know him? I've never seen that dog look at anyone like that." Shadow's chest rose and fell faster now, as if the scent coming from that small scrap of cloth had unlocked something buried deep inside him. He didn't move forward yet, not quite, but he didn't turn away either. And for a dog who had spent weeks pretending the world didn't exist, that was enough to make every volunteer freeze in place. The man didn't push. He simply stayed seated on the cold floor, leaning back slightly, as though he was prepared to be there for as long as it took. Around them, the other kennels echoed with barks, howls, and the metallic rattle of eager paws against wire. But between Shadow and the man, there was silence. Life in the shelter had a rhythm, a relentless, noisy heartbeat. Mornings began with the clatter of feeding bowls. Volunteers made their rounds, refilling water buckets, scooping kibble into stainless steel dishes, sliding them under gates. Dogs barked for attention, tails thumping like drums. The smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, sharp, clean, but always carrying an undercurrent of wet fur and stale bedding. Shadow's routine was different. He didn't rush to the gate when food arrived. He waited until the volunteer stepped back, then crept forward, shoulders hunched, to eat in small, careful bites. Any sudden sound sent him retreating to his corner. When the kennels were cleaned, Shadow endured it in silence. Volunteers spoke softly to him, sometimes leaving a treat in the corner of his bed. He ignored it until they left. No matter how gentle the hand, no matter how kind the voice, his trust stayed locked away. Whispers about him had started to travel between the staff. Not cruel, but heavy with resignation. "He's just too far gone. We can't keep him here forever. It's sad, but some dogs never come back from whatever happened to them." Some believed he had been abused. Others thought maybe he had been abandoned for months, even years. But there was no way to know. Shadow's story existed only in scars no one could see, and in the way his body curled inward as if trying to protect itself from an invisible threat. But that Wednesday morning changed the rhythm. The man came back the next day, and the day after that. Each time, he sat in the same spot, placing the same bandana on the ground between them. He didn't call Shadow's name, didn't whistle, didn't even make eye contact for long. He just sat, patient, steady, unshakable. Some days, Shadow would inch closer. Other days, he stayed rooted in his corner, but his eyes never left the man. The staff began to notice small changes, so small they might have missed them if they weren't looking. The first was his posture. He no longer pressed himself flat against the wall. Instead, he sat with his head slightly raised, ears angled toward the man's voice. The second was his breathing. Less frantic, less shallow. And the third, the smallest, but perhaps the most important, was the way his tail no longer tucked tight between his legs. It didn't wag, but it rested loosely against the floor. The man never explained himself to the shelter workers, and they didn't press him. But late one afternoon, Marissa, the young volunteer who had tried reading to Shadow, asked quietly, "Why him? Why Shadow?" The man's eyes stayed on the German shepherd, his voice low but certain. "Because someone gave up on him. I won't." The weeks wore on, and Shadow's world began to stretch beyond the corner of his kennel. He learned to sniff at the bandana when the man left it. He began to watch him leave, not with fear, but with a quiet longing that no one had seen before. Yet, despite this progress, whispers still floated through the shelter hallways. "He's improving, but not fast enough. We can't keep extending his time." For a place always at capacity, every kennel was a lifeline for another dog in need. And as unfair as it felt, the truth was simple. Shadow's future was hanging by a thread. What the shelter staff didn't know, what no one knew, was that the man had already made up his mind. And very soon, he would tell them exactly what he intended to do. By the third week, the shelter workers had stopped asking if the man would return. They simply expected him, the same time, every day. Moving with quiet certainty down the row of kennels until he reached the very last one. Shadow knew, too. The first few days, he would lift his head only when the man sat down. Now, by the time those familiar boots appeared at the far end of the hall, Shadow's ears were already up. His eyes followed the man's every step, tracking him like a shadow. In reverse. That day, the man carried something new. It wasn't food, it wasn't a toy. It was a worn, folded towel, soft from years of use. He placed it gently on the ground beside the bandana, just outside the kennel bars. Shadow sniffed at the air. And something shifted almost imperceptible, but it was there. The man spoke for the first time. "You don't have to come closer," he said softly. "I'll wait." His voice wasn't coaxing or commanding. It was steady, grounded, as if he were speaking to an equal. Shadow blinked slowly, tilting his head just slightly, as though trying to understand. The other dogs barked and whined, throwing themselves against their gates for attention. Volunteers moved up and down the aisle, cleaning kennels, checking food and water. But none of it seemed to exist for the man or the German Shepherd. They were locked in a quiet, invisible conversation. Over the next hour, the man didn't move closer, but he didn't move away either. He simply sat, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze calm. And then, almost like a whisper of wind through tall grass, Shadow's body shifted. His front paw edged forward. Just a few inches, then stopped. His muscles tensed, but he didn't retreat. The man didn't react. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply let the moment breathe. When visiting hours ended, the man stood slowly, tucking the bandana and towel back into his satchel. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. His voice low enough that only Shadow could hear. And he kept his word. The next day, something remarkable happened. Shadow was already waiting by the front of the kennel when the man arrived. Not pressed against the bars, but close enough that the shadows no longer swallowed him. His ears flicked forward as the man sat down, placing the towel and bandana on the floor again. This time, the German Shepherd didn't hesitate. He took 2 slow steps forward, his paws almost silent against the concrete. His head lowered, his eyes fixed on the objects between them. The man remained perfectly still. He knew trust was fragile, and one wrong move could shatter it. Shadow's nose touched the bandana first, just a brief inhale, then a pause. His tail twitched once, the tiniest flicker of movement. Then, he stepped back. For anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant. But to the shelter staff watching from a distance, it was monumental. The whispers in the hallway began to change. "Did you see that?" He sniffed it. "I've never seen him do that before. Maybe there's a chance." Over the following days, the small steps became a slow dance of trust. Shadow began meeting the man at the front of the kennel, his nose twitching toward that familiar scent. Sometimes, his paw would brush the towel. Sometimes, he would linger just a moment longer before retreating, and each time, the man's reaction was the same. Quiet patience. No reaching, no grabbing. Just being there. One afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. The shelter's old roof groaned under the weight of the rain. And the sound of thunder made several dogs bark frantically. Shadow froze at the first crack of lightning. His body tensed, ears pinned back, eyes darting toward the darkest corner. The man's voice cut through the chaos, low and even. "It's all right, I've got you." Shadow's head turned. His eyes locked on the man. For a moment, it was as if the rest of the world, the thunder, the barking, the rain, disappeared. Instead of running back to his corner, Shadow lowered himself onto the floor, keeping his gaze steady on the one human who had never rushed him, never demanded, never given up. It wasn't a leap into trust, but it was the first time he chose not to hide. By the end of that week, the man approached the shelter director. "I want to start the adoption process," he said simply. The director hesitated. "He's still very reserved. Are you sure?" The man nodded once. "I know what he needs. I'm willing to give him the time." The paperwork began that day. And while the staff still worried about how Shadow would adapt outside the shelter, there was something in the man's presence that made them believe, maybe for the first time, that this dog's story could still have a happy ending. What they didn't know was that the real transformation hadn't even started yet. That would come later, in a small house on the edge of town, where Shadow would be tested in a way no one could have predicted, and where something shocking would happen. It was the morning before the adoption papers were finalized. The shelter was unusually quiet, a rare pause between feeding time and visiting hours. The aisles were empty, the air filled only with the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Shadow was at the front of his kennel, waiting. The man walked in, his boots leaving faint marks on the wet floor where a volunteer had just mopped. As always, he stopped in front of the German Shepherd's kennel, sat down cross-legged, and placed the towel and bandana on the ground. But today, he brought something else. From his satchel, he pulled a small stainless steel bowl, filled with chunks of boiled chicken. The scent drifted through the air, warm and savory. Shadow's nose twitched immediately, his eyes locking onto it with instinctive hunger. The man set the bowl down, not at the very front, but halfway between himself and the kennel's back wall. Then he leaned back, hands resting loosely on his knees, and waited. For a long time, Shadow didn't move. He stood frozen, caught between two forces, fear and longing. His paws shifted slightly on the concrete floor. His ears flicked forward, then back. His body leaned an inch forward, then retreated again. The man didn't speak. He didn't encourage or coax. He simply existed there, as steady as a mountain. Finally, Shadow took a step, then another. His nails clicked softly against the concrete, each movement slow, deliberate. His head stayed low, his eyes flicking between the chicken and the man. When he reached the bowl, he didn't dive in. He sniffed cautiously, took one small piece between his teeth, and stepped back again. But he didn't return to the corner. Not this time. The man allowed himself the smallest smile, not of victory, but of recognition. Trust, fragile as glass, had begun to take shape. Shadow returned to the bowl, this time eating without retreating. The sound of his chewing echoed faintly in the quiet aisle. For the first time the man could see the dog's full frame. Still thin, still worn, but no longer curled inward like a creature waiting for a blow. When the bowl was empty, Shadow lingered. His eyes didn't drop to the floor. Instead, they lifted, meeting the man's gaze fully. It was a simple look, but in it was a message as clear as words. I see you. The breakthrough didn't go unnoticed. From the observation window, Marissa covered her mouth, her eyes wide. The shelter director stood beside her, shaking their head in disbelief. That's the first time I've seen him hold eye contact with anyone, Marissa whispered. And it's not fear, the director replied. It's something else. The man reached into his satchel one last time, pulling out the bandana. This time, he didn't just place it on the floor. He held it in his open palm, still as stone. Shadow stepped forward, slow but sure. His nose touched the fabric. Inhaling deeply, he lingered there for several seconds before stepping back, not toward the corner, but to a spot only a foot from the man's hand. It was close enough that, for the first time, the man could see the faint flecks of amber in Shadow's brown eyes. The moment ended when another volunteer entered the aisle, wheeling a cart of fresh bedding. The sudden sound made Shadow flinch and retreat halfway to his corner. But he didn't vanish completely. His eyes stayed on the man, his body still turned toward him. It was a step, a small one, but in the fragile language of trust, it was monumental. Later that day, the man signed the final papers. The adoption was official. The staff gathered quietly at the end of the aisle, watching as the kennel door opened. Shadow stood frozen, eyes wide, body tense. The man didn't pull or drag. He simply held the leash loosely in one hand, letting it rest on the floor, waiting. After several minutes, Shadow took the first step over the threshold, then another. His paws touched the shelter floor outside his kennel for the first time in months, and with each step down that aisle, past the barking dogs and clanging gates, the man walked beside him, not leading, not following, but keeping pace. By the time they reached the front door, Shadow's breathing had quickened, his tail low but not tucked. He glanced back once at the rows of kennels behind him, and then forward, toward the open air. The man pushed the door open. Sunlight poured in, warm and golden. Shadow hesitated, then stepped into it. What happened next was quiet, almost invisible to anyone but the man. Shadow's ears lifted slightly, his tail loosened, hanging in a relaxed curve. His eyes scanned the parking lot, wide but not panicked. It was his first moment outside, in a world that didn't mean danger. The man crouched beside him, one hand resting on the leash, the other holding the bandana. He tied it gently around Shadow's neck, the faded cloth settling against his fur, like a promise. You're coming home, he said softly, And though Shadow couldn't speak, something in his posture, a slow, deep exhale, was as close to an answer as the man could hope for. The shelter staff watched them leave, some with tears in their eyes. They knew the real journey was just beginning. Trust could be built in moments, but true healing would take time. What none of them knew was how soon that trust would be tested, or that the dog who once hid in the corner would soon do something no one expected. The ride home was quiet. Shadow sat in the back seat, the bandana still tied loosely around his neck, his body stiff as a board. His eyes darted to the window, then to the man, then back again. Every time the car slowed for a red light, his ears twitched at the sound of passing traffic. The man didn't speak much, just enough to keep his voice familiar. "You're all right, Shadow. We're almost there." He didn't reach back to touch him, didn't try to force comfort. He knew the rules now. Trust came slowly, and it had to be earned over and over again. When they arrived, the man opened the back door and stepped aside. Shadow didn't move. His paws stayed planted, his body angled toward the farthest corner of the seat. The man didn't tug the leash. Instead, he sat on the driveway a few feet away from the car, waiting. He rested his forearms on his knees, his posture relaxed, his gaze turned slightly to the side. Minutes passed. A light breeze carried the scent of grass, earth, and something new, freedom. Shadow's nose twitched. He shifted his weight forward. Then, with one cautious step, he hopped down onto the driveway. The man smiled faintly. "Welcome home." The house was small, tucked at the edge of a wooded lot. The air smelled of pine and rain-soaked soil. Inside, the man had prepared a space for him, a low, soft bed near the fireplace, a stainless steel bowl of water, and a toy that had seen better days but was still whole. Shadow explored in slow, careful movements, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. He sniffed each corner, each doorway, each piece of furniture. Every time a floorboard creaked, he froze for a moment before resuming. The man didn't follow him. He let the dog map the space in his own time. Only when Shadow returned to the living room did the man gently set down a fresh bowl of food. For a while, they simply coexisted, two shapes in the same quiet room, breathing the same air, learning the rhythm of each other's presence. That night, the man stayed in the living room, not because the couch was comfortable, but because Shadow needed to know that someone was there. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickers of gold and orange across the walls. Shadow didn't curl up in the bed the man had bought him. Instead, he settled halfway between the bed and the couch. His body angled so he could see both the man and the front door. Sometime after midnight, the man stirred from a light doze and found Shadow watching him. The dog's eyes didn't turn away when their gazes met. Instead, he let out a slow breath and lowered his head to his paws. It was small, but it was trust. Over the next few days, a pattern began to form. Morning walks through the wooded path behind the house. Afternoons spent lying near the open window, the breeze carrying scents that made Shadow's nose twitch. Evenings where the man read aloud from a book, his voice filling the room with a steady, calming rhythm. Shadow was still wary of sudden noises, the slam of a cupboard, the rattle of a dropped spoon. These made him flinch, but he no longer ran to hide. Instead, he looked to the man first, searching his face for cues. And every time, the man's expression stayed the same, calm, steady, safe. It was on the fourth night that something happened, something that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. The man was sitting on the floor, sorting through a box of old photographs. Shadow approached, slow but deliberate, and stopped just a foot away. He leaned forward, sniffed the man's hand, and then, without warning, pressed his nose gently against the man's arm. It wasn't a nudge for attention, it was a question. Man froze, not in fear, but in reverence for the moment. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and let it hover an inch above Shadow's head. The dog didn't move away, so the man lowered his hand, fingers brushing lightly over the fur between his ears. Shadow closed his eyes. It was the first touch he had allowed since arriving at the shelter. That night, the man didn't sleep on the couch, and Shadow didn't stay in the living room. He padded quietly into the bedroom and settled at the foot of the bed. Not on it. Not next to the man, but close enough to hear his breathing through the night. For the first time in a long time, both man and dog slept without the weight of loneliness pressing down on them. But peace has a way of testing itself. The next evening, as rain pattered softly against the roof, something outside stirred. A crunch of gravel in the driveway. The sound of a latch on the back gate. Shadow's head lifted instantly, ears forward, body tense. The man hadn't heard it yet, but Shadow had, and in the next few seconds, he would prove that the frightened dog who once hid in a corner was gone, and something stronger had taken his place. The man finally noticed the sound. A faint creak of the gate latch outside, a shadow moving across the rain-slicked driveway. He stood up, brow furrowed, but before he could step toward the door, Shadow was already there, his body angled forward, tail stiff, ears locked on the source of the sound. The man called his name once, softly. Shadow didn't look back. Something deep inside him had shifted. The fear that once made him shrink into corners was gone. Now, there was something else, a steady, unyielding resolve to protect the space, the person, and the fragile trust he had finally claimed as his own. A figure appeared at the back door, a man in a hooded jacket. His face obscured. The rain made it impossible to tell if he was a stranger, a neighbor, or something else entirely. Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between the man he loved and the unknown figure. His hackles rose, but his stance was balanced, not reckless. The intruder hesitated, glancing at the sharp amber eyes fixed on him. Then came a sound the man had never heard from Shadow, not a panicked whimper, not a fearful bark, but a deep, controlled growl. It was the sound of a dog who would not back down. The man reached for the phone in his pocket. "Can I help you?" he called through the glass. The figure mumbled something incoherent, then took a step back, but Shadow didn't move. His gaze tracked the intruder until the man turned away and disappeared into the rain. Only then did Shadow glance over his shoulder, as if checking to see if the man was safe. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and in that moment, the man realized the truth. Shadow wasn't just rescued anymore. He was home, and he knew it. That night, the man sat beside Shadow's bed. "You saved me," he whispered, not caring if the dog understood the words. Because Shadow understood the meaning. For the first time since coming into his life, Shadow closed the space between them entirely. He laid his head on the man's lap, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes. It was more than affection, it was a vow. Months later, the townspeople would tell the story of the German shepherd who had been too afraid to look anyone in the eye. Until the right person came along. They'd talk about how he now trotted confidently down the street, greeting neighbors, his tail wagging, his eyes bright. But the man knew the real miracle wasn't just in the transformation. It was in the quiet, unseen moments, the soft head resting on his knee, the trust given freely, the unspoken promise that they would face the rest of life's storms together. Shadow's past would always be part of him. The scars might never fade completely, but they no longer defined him. And as they walked through the wooded path that morning, sunlight breaking through the clouds, the man realized something simple yet profound. Sometimes, rescuing a dog doesn't just save their life. If Shadow's journey touched your heart, remember, there are countless dogs still waiting in shelters, scared, alone, and wondering if they'll ever find their person. You might be the one they're waiting for. Rescue isn't just about giving a home, it's about giving hope, trust, and a second chance at life. Whether you adopt, foster, volunteer, or simply share stories like Shadow's, you're helping to change a life. So, if this story moved you, hit the like button, share it with someone who loves animals, and subscribe for more real rescue stories that prove love can heal even the deepest wounds. Because sometimes, the right person isn't just their hero, their family, and who knows? The next life-changing story could start with you.